Hi, folks. Shall we begin? Welcome everyone to the closing panel of day one. Thank you all of you again, because we sort of we are a sort of strange panel in the plenary. We have invited ourselves to our own shadi. It's sort of slightly rude, but we thought we'd take some advantage of having home turf. But before I start, slightly unorthodox, but I wanted to extend one special welcome because, IIHS for a long time has been built on the premise of partnerships across the Global South. And they have held us from our very start. And so today, for the first time, some of our colleagues from Cuba have gone across the world to be here, and they got here despite borders and visas and regulations. So if nothing else, just welcome our colleagues from the university that they've made it. So it's such a pleasure to have you here. Yeah, so... So today Cuba gets it. The UCT, South Africa and UK have been here often. This is our first starting, so they'll get welcomed on their own time. So my name is Gautam Bhan. I'm faculty here at IIHS, and I'm joined by other colleagues on the faculty, Sudeshna, Mitra, Shriya, Anand, and Aromar, Revi. And so we are not going to do a paper presentation panel. That's not the point of the session. What we wanted to do was to actually take this opportunity to actually give ourselves also a slight moment of self-reflection in thinking about an institution, a sort of institutional trajectory of our own, and asking a question I think that all of us think about that comes from the theme of the conference, which is when you start thinking about questions of marginalities, what are the kinds of questions you choose to start with? And what are the kinds of problem spaces that you see? And what are the ways you decide what to do? Many of our students are in the room right now, and this is a question they often ask us. Right? So we diagnose systemic inequalities. We diagnose things that cut across scale. We teach them to connect and interconnect, and we tell them everything is interconnected. And then the question that always comes then is, but then where do you start? What do you do? Where do you begin? Knowing that all of those entry points are necessarily imperfect, necessarily incomplete, always frustrating. You pull one thread, three others come apart. You're never quite sure where the right button to press is. And there's always the other imaginary that we'll find just the correct technical fix that will help us get past the politics, just the right political ideology that will help us get past dissent, or just the right win-win situation, even though nothing in our analysis has suggested that win-win situations are actually possible. So what we thought we'd do is to actually give you a series of reflections from our own work. Each of us, me, Shriya, Sudeshna, will take 5 minutes and do 2 rounds. We'll first reflect on some of the ways that we have asked questions about marginality in different sectors. And then we'll take another round of 5 minutes each to reflect on some of the practice work we've been engaged with in trying to work with some of these concepts in real-world contexts and systems. And our hope then is that these reflections kind of also begin to bridge this gap between what we call theory and what we call practice, something we've been trying to push against a lot, right? What it means to link our analytical interventions with getting our hands dirty in very imperfect systems in our context. And then we're going to hand over to Aro to try and synthesize a little bit what it means to think about building an agenda of work, research, and practice at an institutional scale. It's a small sliver of what happens in these buildings, but we thought it would be useful. And just 2 quick things before we start. I think that some of what shares and animates what we do, the first is a kind of belief that if the margin is a relational concept, then it cannot be studied without the center. And in fact, too long, what happens is that the study of the margin is not a study from the margin. And a push to think constantly about systems and thinking about systems that produce margins, and reminding ourselves that margins are only marginal because someone called them marginal. and thinking a little bit about the process of that production. The second is very core to us here at IIHS, which is to try and think to link across multiple forms of marginalities. We all know that the economic, the spatial, the social, the ecological co-constitute each other. But it is not clear how. And it is not always clear how to hold together, whether looking to take from the last panel, the question of the basti is a question of an economic margin or a social margin or a spatial margin. And if it's all three at once, how is it all three at once? How does it mix in different ways? And then which one do you pick up in practice, even though analytically you may be able to connect them, right? And so one of the things that we'll do here, you'll see us push the concept of marginalities to always talk about marginality and inequality together. Because the idea of speaking of inequality reminds us of the systems of power that create margins. The second thing is that you'll see our examples move across three of our work areas. We'll talk about housing, we'll talk about infrastructure, we'll talk about economic development, and we'll talk about social protection. And that is our hope to sort of think about marginalities across what are considered professional sectors of practice, often practiced very separately from each other. The third point we wanted to make is to think about the question of practice itself, which is a question to all of us. To say that when one analyzes in order to understand, does it feel different when you analyze in order to understand what to do? Are those forms of knowledge different? Are analytical knowledge that immediately makes you think of ways of moving somehow different from those that deepen our understanding of what is going on? So very simply, what do you need to know to understand what is happening? And is it different from what you need to know to understand what to do? And our proposition is that those two are different kinds of knowledges, and they need different kinds of skills. And finally, one of the things that we want to then do in our proposition sector is to say that we are not offering these practices as models. They are not best practices, they are not pilots, they are not case studies of what we think we should do. The reason we're offering you these examples is because we think that they are the kinds of practices that can act at scale, that have some ability to build systems from margins, that have some ability to not just speak from the margin, but to imagine a system where they are no longer marginal. Not all practices scale like this. Not all practices have the ability to become the default system. But sometimes we see places where one way of thinking about something, say Sudeshna will talk to you about the idea of off-grid infrastructure. And our idea is to say at what point can off-grid become simply infrastructure and lose the adjective? Because the point of the grid becomes irrelevant. So you displace the norm, right? At what point is the basti simply housing and not informal housing? So what are the practices that today may be margins, but tomorrow have the ability to be adjective-less normatives, can actually be descriptions of the system itself? So those are the logics behind picking these, not any selection of representation or any selection of best practice suggestions. They are some of what we grapple with. So with that, I'll start us off and get to it and tell you. Okay, so first propositions, housing, economic planning, and infrastructure. If you think about housing, there's two kinds of work that I want to sort of share in this space. The first is to think about housing from the central question of land. And to think about housing through the question of land is to think about where the system of how much land is available for what kind of housing becomes the question. So what the report you're seeing on the left is a report that looks at an electoral slogan by the government of Delhi called Jahan Jhuggi Wahan Makan. Translated means where the shack, there the house. The idea of a claim to land that is centered to upgrade housing, basti housing where it is. Not resettlement, not new housing, but the housing that people have built should be sufficient to be recognized as housing itself, with a support and improvement, but it should not be considered a problem that needs to be solved, but actually be considered a solution that needs to be scaled. And this shift in perspective, the point of our work to document how much housing have people built on their own, is not to make an argument that that housing is in some way in need of welfare. It is to make a claim that that housing is already enough, that it deserves recognition as it is without being considered inadequate by the norms of planning standards, environmental standards, and the like. So it is a claim simultaneously to say that if you ask the question, who should build housing in cities of the South, then you should first ask who has built housing in cities of the South. And if you ask that question, then the answer is not the state nor the market. The answer is quite clear. The largest stock of affordable housing built in our cities is built by people. But it is not recognized as construction. It is understood as occupation. Changing the terms of how we approach that housing is a way to think about how we understand even the construct of something called housing policy differently, right? And what that means is beginning from the practice of work that then maps a different geography of housing. What you see on the left, you don't need to see the details, is a very large percentage of houses that are marked in red. Now, this is not a geography of vulnerability. It is not a geography in the way we argued with this data, not a geography of inadequacy. It is not a geography of precarity. We called it a geography of construction, a geography of building, right? Land that has already been developed by people building their own houses over time. But it is also, in systemic inequality, a data point of vulnerability. Because what you're seeing there is also an opportunity to say, all right, how much land is actually built this way? And that answer has two ways to frame it. The first is to say, how much land do bastis take in Delhi? According to government data, about 15% of the city lives in informal housing. This map, which was one of the first area-based slum maps that was made by residents and housing rights activists and researchers that physically went to every one of the 757 settlements, stood on the corners, took GPS readings, and created polygons, not by researchers, but by people, told us that 15% of the city lives on 0.5% of the city's land. Right? Now, this number, the question of that number is linked in a question of marginality and inequality in two ways. The first argument can be, look how little land it is. Why don't we just let it go, legalize? That's not the argument we want to make. The argument we made was, if in 0.5% of land, this much housing can be built, if you make an affordable housing zone that gives us 5% of land, imagine how much housing we can build. It sounds like a small reframing of the argument, but it fundamentally recenters what we look to the margins for. Right? And that's my first example. The second example I want to give you is the question of the study on rental housing arrangements for domestic workers. The point of the study is linked to the second point we made about putting together unlikely sectors of practice. What we work very closely, which is the second author of this report, you see the second logo next to IIHS, with the Rajasthan Mahila Kamgar Union, the Rajasthan Union of Domestic Workers. The union leaders told us one day that in every monthly meeting for the past year, the workers didn't want to talk about wages, collective bargaining, workplace conditions, or decent work. They just wanted to talk about rent. Right? When COVID occurred and hundreds and thousands of workers walked highways in our cities, and the Stranded Workers Action Network did surveys and said, why are you leaving the city at a time of lockdown? 41% answered rent. Not hunger, not disease, not epidemiology, not pandemics, but rent. I think the question for us then is that some forms of inequality need unlikely combinations of research questions, which is to say, is there something specific about housing for domestic workers? And the answer is that there is. Domestic workers in India largely now work between 4 to 5 houses a day within which they walk. This means that the geographical catchment of rental affordable housing for them has to be near the elite colonies where employers live. which means domestic workers do not live in bastis and informal settlements. They do not live in the assumed geography of low-income housing. So the question for us was, but where is this low-income, affordable rental housing next to elite enclaves? We live in these enclaves, we don't see them, right? So we went into Jaipur, we went with union members, and we began following them from home to work. And the domestic workers created a survey and among themselves created the data. We found 103 what we called setups, multiple forms of rental housing arrangements that had we not known were rental housing, we would never have imagined that they were. A large 3-floor, completely pakka structure that looked like an elite housing, that from outside looked like any other 500 gaj plot in Malviya Nagar C scheme in Jaipur. You go inside, 120 single rooms. Cut, invisible from the outside, turned into rental housing setups. A small set of 8 houses between 2 elite gated communities that the builder had built, left neatly out between the borders of both, that became permanent rental housing. Structures that we had never looked at when we looked at the informal housing geographies of our cities, until we looked at housing from the lens of domestic work, instead of looking at housing from the lens of income poverty. Small shifts and unlikely connections change both our research questions and our questions of practice. So our first set of propositions around marginality is to think about the way we frame the data from the margins as sites of system building and proposition, not sites of the evidence of exclusion alone. So that the emphasis is on the capacity and agency at the margins as much as it is to absolutely give evidence to their structural exclusion, but to do that in a way that gives us ways to move forward. And the second one is about putting together unlikely questions so that we break some of the sectoral silos through which we ask questions and find the way systems interconnect so that the union now sees rent as a union labor agenda as important as collective bargaining for wages, and then needs a very different system from which to action that agenda, because unions were not set to work on housing. So how do they do that? And that story you will see break ke baad in the practice session, and I'll hand over to Sudeshna, to Shriya.
So just building on Gautam's introduction, I also wanted to add that some of the work that we are talking about in this panel today reflects, the work of much larger sort of teams of people across the institution, not all of who are a part of this panel, but very much embedded in the work that you're seeing here. So I'll move to the realm of economic planning now. And I'll start with actually 3 disjunctures which actually act to both produce and sustain the kinds of economic marginalities that we see across our cities today. So the first one is really an excessive focus by national and state governments on what are termed as or thought of as growth sectors in the economy, right? These are, tend to be capital intensive, large development projects. In the afternoon panel, we heard about several development projects which actually led to more displacement and not to the promise of livelihoods that were made as part of those projects. What the Indian growth experience clearly shows is that you can have a sustained economic growth trajectory without creating any sort of broad-based gains or benefits for the larger population or for the workforce, right? So we've had an experience of growth alongside stagnant wages, stagnant incomes, continued informalization of work, continued conditions of precarity of work as the dominant sort of mode of work, as well as sharply rising inequalities, right? So what we argue, therefore, is if you start by putting people, workers, or employment at the center of economic planning questions, then that can lead to a very different set of priorities for economic planning, for the selection of neighborhoods for investments, for the spatial targeting of where infrastructure should go, and so on. So that's sort of our first proposition on shifting a focus from sort of growth and GDP and output to a different set of metrics which are centered on people and on employment. The second disjunct, which I'm going to speak about, is actually that between economic planning and urban planning, which is a particular one in the Indian context. And this comes again from a history of economic planning that was set up in the post-independence decades, which was very much sectoral in nature, targeted towards certain kinds of economic sectors, but did not get into spatial or regional aspects. And on the other hand, you have sort of urban planning, which does not actually have the instruments that can allow it to understand economic dynamism and bring it into the frame of urban planning. This continues to be true with really large projects and policies that attempt to bring urbanization and industrialization together, things like the industrial corridor policy, they still lack a sort of frame that can tie together urban governance and urban planning with sort of economic changes that are taking place alongside these policies. And then the third and final disjunct is really on the nature of claims making in Indian cities. And what we see in a lot of the discourse around urban politics is really that it is centered on questions of housing and on infrastructure that Gautam and Sudeshna will talk a little bit more about. There is very limited space to actually have claims which are made around the nature of work itself, right? And there is a limited realm of urban politics which talks about conditions of work, which talks about the space or the infrastructure needed for work to be carried out. So there are some, few exceptions to this, highly visible areas of work like street vending are places where that becomes a space for urban politics. But if you think of vast swaths of informal workers in our cities that are engaged in different kinds of economies like repair, like waste, like construction, those are just not part of the realm of urban politics and claims making oversights to work. So the way that we have then tried to bring what we think of as these kinds of inclusions and marginalizations into the core of our work, I'll talk about two sets of bodies of work. The first one is on really looking at both policy and plan-based interventions into bringing the informal economy into the center of planning, okay? And there are two instances I'll talk about. One is actually working with the state system to bring informal work into the frame, and the second is working from outside the state system. So the first engagement here is one that we had, with the state government of Rajasthan, who asked us to give them sort of a policy frame that could put informal work at the center of cities. And here again, we were able to make a couple of arguments. One was on understanding the interlinkages between informal work and informal housing and the spatiality of how these marginalities are co-constituted and therefore need to be addressed together, as Gautam had said. The second point we were able to raise was on really starting to think about economic infrastructure for the informal economy to support different kinds of work, not to only think about social infrastructure, but to think of economic infrastructure of different kinds for workers. And then the final argument that we were able to make was on thinking through sort of spatial instruments that could enhance the productivity of informal workers to be able to bring returns to informal work closer to what they are in the formal economy. We'll hear more about this in the social protection component, which we will come to in the second part. But the second piece of work that I wanted to reference, which is really work done by colleagues, I think Rashi was on a panel earlier today speaking about the Maybe Delhi campaign. But this was, several of our colleagues were part of a people's-led campaign to respond to the Delhi master plan, and it brought together groups of informal workers, residents, and a sort of wider coalition of actors to really visibilize spatial claims for informal work. And in response to the draft master plan of the Delhi government, they were able to raise a series of objections and raise a series of demands. And I think the important thing about these different modes is that I think what we've learned through the Delhi experience has then come into a lot of our work with the state system, right? And I think the second part of what I'm going to speak about, we have brought a lot of this learning into going back to state practices and planning and giving them recommendations from this work. So that brings me to the second cluster of work, which is really around a set of methods that aim to visualize the full diversity of economic activities, that really sustain our cities. So this work was done for the city of Bangalore, where we spent several years actually assembling a data set of all sorts of enterprises, starting from 1 and 2 member enterprises, which actually are the mainstay of our urban economies, all the way up to sort of formal manufacturing and IT clusters. And what it allowed us to show is the ways in which the IT-dominated areas of the city continue to remain the dominant sites where a lot of our investments are directed. And actually the largest employment clusters of the city, which are sort of informal and formal manufacturing clusters, tend to be completely ignored and sidelined in the sort of larger imagination of planning for the city. So we've also used this work on the geography of employment and of enterprises across the city to then argue for how, for example, transport planning could be made more inclusive of this imagination of different kinds of and diversities of economies. And I think Sudeshna will speak more to this in the second part of our provocations. And how transport planning, for example, could enhance rather than displace different kinds of economies that were in these neighborhoods, right? And how, for example, space around metro stations could be used to imagine infrastructure for informal workers, storage spaces, for example, and so on. And now we are actually taking some of the methods developed for this work to advise the Chennai Metropolitan Development Authority on inputs for the third master planning process. We are sort of, again, trying to put employment back into the center of the planning process and provide sort of an understanding of an employment geography of the city that can then enable them to plan for the full spectrum.
Okay, so I'm going to take some time and talk about some parts of the work that we are doing around infrastructure. And when I use the word infrastructure, in this case, I'm actually focusing particularly on the physical infrastructure, so water, sewerage, electricity, those kinds of issues. I mean, infrastructure has a much larger definition, but for now and what I'm going to talk about, I'll focus on that. So again, within sort of the planning practice that is sort of embedded within the master plan approach, there is, or even inside planning schools and planning pedagogy in India, there is a lot of emphasis on thinking about physical infrastructure in terms of pipes, in terms of grids. So if you think about water, you have to think about where does the water network pipe grid go across the city, sewerage the same, electricity the same. And it is possible to look at a map and look at a spatial coverage of a network and get a sense that, okay, about 30% of the city or 60% of the city or 80% of the city has a pipe that goes somewhere close to this. But at the same time, this kind of a map says absolutely nothing about the infrastructural life, the everyday life of what that infrastructure means, because the pipes don't mean delivery. It does not mean service provision. So there are much larger kind of structural issues that are associated with what is the kind of, the amount of water, for example, and I'm sure all of you are fully aware of, for example, the fight that's happening between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu around water sharing, and Bangalore is a very big part or piece of that puzzle. And so there is an upper limit when we're thinking structurally in terms of the capacities that can be delivered through these pipes, right? And so in some ways, in thinking about this infrastructure, I think some of our starting point is to kind of de-link ourselves of thinking about infrastructure only in terms of pipes or grids. And the push there is to kind of, think about how do we move forward from there? So just bringing in the term off-grid as a way to then start to hold what is happening with infrastructure that goes beyond thinking about pipes. And there's a couple of different ways to read this, right? So this is drawing on some work that we did as a part of this project, which is a UKRI GCRF project. In fact, you'll hear more about this project tomorrow as well. We have a panel on this. But the push in the call itself was to say that let's start by saying that the infrastructural reality for many residents in the global south, in cities of the global south, is that it's not a gridded life. So what if they are living inside an off-grid reality? What does that look like? So we did this work across in a neighborhood, and this is just an example from that, to start to capture what is, like, just to start from, like, how is the neighborhood getting access to water? And what you see over here in this sort of a schematic is like these different kinds of sets of things from which, which has been put together in a layered way. And it's this one, which is, the city grid. It's the Kaveri connection. It's the drinking water. It comes 3 times a week. It comes 2 hours per day in those 3 times a week. But that's literally one piece of the puzzle. And then you have everything from, a water ATM that's drawing on groundwater. You're talking about water tankers that kind of going into the larger hydrology of the city. It's drawing water from the different lakes. It's got bore wells that's feeding into those. They're both public and private. There are wells that have been dug into that area. There is also a microgrid that has been built in that particular neighborhood, which is drawing entirely from borewell water in that particular area. And so even if you sort of unpack it at that first level, the grid is not the only way that people are accessing water. There are all of these other ways. But taking it a little bit further and sort of asking that when you have an off-grid solution, and we have always sort of thought about the off-grid solution in terms of that, in the materiality of, say, the water ATM or the water tanker. But the off-grid solution are also the humans that animate those systems. So even when we are talking about the city grid or we're talking about the microgrid, there is a whole set of humans, like starting from valve men to people who are, the local repairmen, to the people who are fixing the wires when the meter burns out, who are involved. They are the off-grid solutions which actually get to the, getting that water inside the households itself, right? And so the off-grid is not just thinking about the pipes and whether the materiality of the water ATM, but also off-grid in terms of the humans that are part of that system, but also all of the other non-human, like topography is a big part of it. There is a part of this site that floods every year. It is the marginal part of, even with, this is definitely a low-income neighborhood that we worked in, but even within this income gradations, there are sort of the recent migrants, and they are sort of. So I just want to kind of firstly, this is that provocation that once we start taking a different kind of a frame and entry point, different questions emerge. So that, sort of relates to this next, you sort of see this other thing where we're talking about repair, and we're talking about that when infrastructure is thought about, it's also thought about these capital investments in laying down the grid. But there isn't a thought process about how is that grid going to be maintained. Where is the salaries of the various people who are maintaining that grid over the life cycle of that project is going to come from. So when we're thinking of off-grid, we're also thinking about this, really sort of changing the narrative and talking about prioritizing repair as a part of service delivery itself. Now, in asking the question differently, we also start to see that different kinds of, different kinds of questions. What this, graph shows on that side is basically, again, there's a narrative about how there is a formalization. If something doesn't have a formal grid, then there is sort of a progressive provision of a grid or provision of water, and therefore you become formalized. But if you see the trajectory of this one neighborhood itself, you see that actually it started with something that is, so the way to read this is grid and off-grid, and also the timeline. So it starts with, sort of the wells, and sort of people sort of dig their own bore wells, and then it gets the Kaveri pipeline. As per the narrative that's there in policy, you would say the problem has been solved because they got the coverage, they got the city grid. But it was nowhere near enough. And so then that gets supplemented by the borewell grid. It needs a water ATM because the borewell water is not fit to drink. And so the water ATM is basically something that does reverse osmosis on the borewell water, so it makes it fit to drink. And you have the water ATM. Even that's not enough. You have the water tanker. You have, the Kaveri connection, which becomes from a community tap to a household tap. And so this completely sort of, throws away our idea of sort of somehow this linear progression of going off-grid to grid, informal to formal, and this allows us to then interact with infrastructure or think about proposition infrastructure in very different ways. So I'm going to, okay.
So to close that first round, the poet Audre Lorde once wrote in some of her work that there is a radical possibility that we were never broken at all, but actually our strengths were hidden from us. And that is actually the way power and marginalization work. So in some ways, the impetus of thinking from the South, which a lot of people have invoked today, is a very similar imposition. It is to challenge two kinds of foundations. What if we begin from different positions? What if planning begins from work and not land? What if housing begins from production and repair and not construction and real estate? What if infrastructure begins from the water that comes out of the tap rather than the pipe grid that is supposed to get it there? And what if the research and diagnosis that we do is not to diagnose inadequacy and our distance from a certain modern / European ideal, but actually a reality of beginning and valuing where we are and thinking of that as already enough. But the question there for us then is also that it would be naive in a question of structural inequality to begin with the ethic of valuing what we are, recognizing its agency and its power, but not acknowledging its current vulnerability, which is why the questions of marginality become very important. It is also important that the onus of countering vulnerability cannot remain only with the vulnerable. And that is what a systemic approach to inequality differs on thinking about questions of change and transformation. So what this means also is that in some of our propositions, analytically, we're seeking to make an argument that we should be careful of what we consider problems to be solved and where our solutions are. We should take our existing systems as already enough, not to be found lacking. So Abdul Simon, when writing his wonderful text on African cities, called the book For the Cities Yet to Come. And he was being ironic because his argument was African cities are already here, but we are constantly told that they are yet to come, yet to become modern, yet to become New York, yet to become Paris, yet to become Vienna. But now this is 2023, so really yet to become Shanghai, Singapore, and Dubai. Paris, New York, and London have sort of had their moment. So I think if you think a little bit about then the practice part of it, the examples we'll give you in our next very quick round, note to self and others, is that we're going to think through actually propositions that directly speak to the state. This is not because we think that the state is the only actor in a system that has to practice, but we believe that one part of systemic inequality is public, and that the role of public institutions has to be central to that work. So really quickly go back to our list to think just of some work we've been involved in, and we think of these practices as what are the structures that can then help the margins become the center and can help us create material conditions, very specific, material conditions that very straightforwardly let people pick certain fights and survive, as opposed to let people pick certain fights and not be able to survive the fight itself, which is largely the story of marginalization. The first two are two examples of large policy shifts that we've been part of, along with a large range of movements and other actors. These are deeply collective processes, and I want to emphasize that. The one on the left, the one on your left, is the largest contemporary land titling scheme in an Indian state. So the Odisha government 4 years ago took a singular decision to legalize and give land titles to all quote-unquote slums in the state in all urban areas. Right? No questions asked, no questions of cutoff dates, no questions of when you came, where you are, as you are, titles, not pattas, licenses or leases, no conditions, full property rights. And this, I think, is a really important way to think about a structural intervention that changes the material conditions of inequality. It does not erase them, right? That the infrastructure vulnerability of these settlements don't change. But the conditions of land make possible moves that were no longer possible before these legalizations, right? The one on the right is a slightly different approach, which is that the Rajasthan government, India has for a long time had one of the world's largest public employment programs, which is called the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee. 100 days of paid work, inflation index to every adult member of every rural household. We have never had an urban equivalent. This is a longer story of urban-rural development in India, where the rural has always been the site of welfare and the urban the site of capital. But this is one of the largest and first legal employment guarantees for urban areas. So the text translated is called the Indira Gandhi Urban Employment Guarantee Scheme. It is the urban equivalent of what we colloquially call NREGA, the Rural Employment Guarantee, that now in law guarantees 125 days, actually more than the 100 here, of work. And I want to point these two out both as interventions that are looking to create an employment regime that is not dependent on a notion of productivity and skilling, but is looking to create a safety net. But it is a provision inside the urban employment guarantee I want to draw your attention to, which is the question of urban NREGA is, what should the work be? And the argument that a lot of groups made, led by the People's Action for Employment Guarantee, of which we are a part, was to include two types of permitted works in urban NREGA that only exist in the urban form. The first, it allows people to use urban NREGA wages to repair their own homes and get wages for their labor. The second is it allows the state to use urban NREGA funds to repair publicly built housing that has fallen into disrepair, built under the central and state public housing schemes. The third, which is a proposition that has not yet been accepted, is that urban NREGA should be used not just for manual work like it is in rural areas, but actually for skilling programs and apprenticeship payments so that they actually become payments to workers while they acquire greater degrees of skill. So that the rethinking the notion of what the employment program supports to condition it to mobility as opposed to baseline social protection is the aim of an expanded urban employment guarantee program. And that's the propositional example I wanted to give of how an idea of center it around work and employment translates in a particular section 2, subpoint 6, subsection G, that allows you to use state funds for skilling under a social protection program. And this translation into actual modes of large-scale state practice is the kind of translation between theory and practice that we're arguing inequality needs if it's going to move just from marginality towards actually systemic change.
So I'll as we sort of continue our whirlwind tour of different forms of marginalities, I'm going to switch a little bit to actually places that are forming margins rather than particular groups of people. And this is here, I'm talking about the margin of what is considered urban in the Indian context. So some of our earlier work has looked at questions of settlements as they transition from rural to urban. What are the kinds of gaps in policy and planning that arise? And what are the kinds of planning frameworks that can actually anticipate change rather than react to it later? So in the Indian context, we actually have a very sharp governance disconnect between when a settlement transitions from rural to urban, even though actual economic change on the ground is slower, but the governance frame is a sharp binary. And what this means is that, given the sort of uneven history of the implementation of the 73rd and the 74th constitutional amendments, we actually have panchayats and institutions of rural governance as being much stronger and more powerful than urban local bodies. There is also a political economy of a newer taxation regime that kicks in when a settlement goes from rural to urban. And local bodies actually have a disincentive to convert to urban, whereas in some cases, residents are actually demanding better service provision as they transition to urban status. This is also applicable to a difference in the schemes that are applicable in rural and urban areas. Gautam spoke about the example of the NREGA. Of course, Rajasthan is an exception rather than the norm across the country. Rural settlements will lose access to one of the largest social protection measures as they transition to urban. So what we see on the ground is a differentiated set of urbanization processes across rural settlements and census towns. Some are driven by proximity to large urban centers and the drivers and dynamics that come with that. Others are driven by their proximity to large planned projects of urbanization, which are like large highways, large industrial parks and projects. And finally, those that have actually seen population growth, densification, and economic change without any of these large external drivers. This is really the subaltern urbanization thesis, which was put forward by Partha Mukhopadhyay and Eric Dennis. But what we argue is that we see a very different set of dynamics across these different kinds of urbanization patterns and settlements. And as a result, we argue that you need a different set of policy responses. So in our work with the government of Rajasthan on coming up with a policy frame to support this question of urban transition, we actually suggested an institutional response that could basically ease this transition and make it a more gradual process and also address some of these political economy disincentives to convert from rural to urban. So some of the measures that we suggested were an extension of rural schemes in urban areas following the transition, as well as early applicability of urban schemes before the area was actually transitioning. We also recommended a governance architecture that could build capacity for settlements as they undergo this transition. This included a state-level cadre of urban trained professionals that could work at these settlements, that could actually put in place what we called settlement transition enabling plans, and come up with a sort of body of projects that could actually help ease this transition and provide the kind of infrastructure that was now needed in this settlement. The set of projects that we wanted to prioritize under the plan also, highlighted the intersectionality of some of these different kinds of marginalities. So we wanted to privilege employment-intensive projects that focused on inclusive housing, that focused on ecological restoration, and so on. But overall, I just wanted to step back and argue that, again, here, in this case, we were focusing very much on the state as a key site of operationalizing this, because, also the state in this case is the key actor that's producing this binary to begin with and is definitely the response that was needed.
So I'm going to shift the gaze back. Thanks, Shriya. So I'm going to, a lot of that work was looking at sort of the urban transition, smaller settlements becoming larger settlements, and what's that happening. Shifting the gaze back to the main city, right? So a lot of our work is also looking at, for example, also moving to another kind of infrastructure. A lot of the infrastructure focus that has come to be has been in more of the large investment, spectacular kind of infrastructure. So, the airport projects, the metro projects, something that is associated with the city modernizing, etc. Sometimes associated with legacies of certain governments that are in power at that time. Now, a lot of times when these large investment, large infrastructure projects are happening within the urban fabric of a city, they also come with their own governance structures, which are just to give a quick example, the JNNURM came with the requirement that you had to prepare a city development plan, which was a new thing. The Amrut is associated with the SLIPs, the SAAPs, the annual plans. Smart cities have their SPVs. When we talk about the TOD and metro projects that are coming up in a lot of cities, we have these land and transport authorities that are now being created. So in Bangalore, for example, the BMLTA has been created. Now, in these new, this separate governance structures, they're associated with their own revenue structures, they're associated with new ways of taking planning permissions, sometimes with new plans that are associated. And so while there is, these are brownfield projects, because they're happening inside the urban fabric of the city, the institutional vision that is associated with a lot of these projects is greenfield. Because the idea of these new governance structures is that it is going to reinstitute powers in a new authority and take that away from a lot of government authorities and government these things which have long legacies and their own revenue structures, create new funds perhaps, and sort of, redirect some of the funds that has been collected in the city to these new funds. Now, what that is, so in a lot of the projects that we're working in, including the Bangalore one, we are involved with the TOD project here, what we see and in that situation is that while there is so much being written about public-private partnerships, there isn't necessarily a lot being written about public-public partnerships. Or what are the protocols for two government departments to come together and work together. And this, this move towards creating new authorities and this greenfield kind of structures ends up creating a lot of tension when we're talking about the operationalization or the implementation of a lot of these plans and visions that's happening as well. And what we see that within this scheme of things is, which we're seeing in Bangalore as well, that then the priority becomes the areas that are unproblematic, the places that don't have tenure problems, the places that are not, separate from what is being seen as the normal. Those become the pilot projects. Those become the lighthouse projects. That's where the new investment is going in. And so the areas within, so if, for example, a mini master plan is being created for TOD, the slums and informal settlements that are there within these areas, the home-based work that is happening inside the residences in these areas, the industrial areas which may have, maybe in the process of deindustrialization, other things are going on, those become basically excluded from this vision, or they sort of go to the end of the line. And it's like they get the least amount of interest, say, let's take that up later. Let's pick this something else that is easier to deal with earlier. And so kind of going back to what I was talking about earlier in the first set as well, is that what we're also facing right now. So I'm actually like, in this, it's not a proposal. It's a proposal of a proposal because we're still in the middle of this project, is that what we're also seeing is that if the state is actually not delivering all this infrastructure, and if we have already recognized earlier that there is a whole assemblage of actors that are actually delivering a lot of these services, then this kind of a prioritization of the normal areas or the pilot projects and the lighthouse projects is not only marginalizing certain kinds of areas where this implementation is going to be done, it's also marginalizing the process of implementation and thinking only, for example, how BDA or BBMP or a BESCOM is going to respond, but not necessarily the other constellation of actors that are involved with providing services or is involved with housing construction or is involved with a lot of other kind of activities, the actual planning and the construction that's happening in these areas. And so the push then becomes that when we then talk about capacity development of government bodies or figuring out these protocols of public-private, this thing, then it's not that the capacity development comes at the end of that chain. It's not one of those feel-good things that, all our government departments have less capacity. But to also think about capacity development as sort of this reframing of thinking about governance, that when these things are being rewritten in greenfield sorts of institutional structures, new revenue sources, where is the space for the other actors that are also building the city? Where is the space for the revenue to flow in different ways? So again, like I said, that we are still, about 6 months away from coming up with the final proposal, but this is the direction. So as a part of this project, we're also involved not only with the planning proposition and the implementation, but actually the capacity development part as well. And so that becomes a very critical part of thinking about the implementation of taking this forward as well. So I'll stop there.
So I'll close and hand over to Aro to think us through some of these, but just a final reflection from my side on an honest admission that grappling with translation of some of the changes we want politically, aesthetically, notionally, analytically, and finding homes for them in actually existing institutions in our cities is, I think, a kind of knowledge work that honestly there's a reason we bring this up in an academic conference, because these are kinds of knowledge works for which we constantly find ourselves undertrained and underprepared. There are ways in which I think that a lot of the way we consider institutions of teaching, that our role is to give us the rigor of analytical complexity, but those claims have to find homes in the world. And they have to find homes in a world that does not necessarily want to receive them. And so the questions of finding ways that go from tactics to subterfuge, to power moves, to oppositions, it is only in hindsight that practitioners are able to tell you why they did what they did. And there is a reason for that. But the hindsight of practitioners who came before us has to become the foresight of the practitioners we want to become. And I think that one of the questions that we want to sort of insist on is that the study of inequality and marginality needs to center the questions of translation into practice as strongly as it does the diagnosis of our vulnerabilities. A lot of the best definition of Southern urbanism or cities of the South that I have always worked with is from South African urbanists Edgar Peterson and Abdul Malik Simon. And they define the South as cities where the majority held vulnerability. It's very simple. Not cities in the developing world, not a geography, but an idea. cities where the majority hold vulnerability. But the impetus of that framing is that our response has to address vulnerability for the majority, not in a pilot, not in a single settlement, not outside systems. And the two ways we're suggesting from our work here, one is to claim as systems practices we currently consider marginal and to refuse their marginalization. And the second is to look at systems that are at least called systems, the systems of the public and the systems of the state, and to insert as normative common sense, in the Gramscian sense, these ideas that these practices are the basis of systems themselves, not exceptions, not case studies, not cities waiting to come, but cities that are already urban. But cities whose recognition then needs the support that can allow them to really step in and be the fullness of the systems that they are. So we know that people already build housing. What we don't know is what housing people would build if we believed in people building housing. And that's what remains as a future that we can craft. And that's one way to think out towards a different kind of horizon from current systems of inequality. So I'll hand to Aro to reflect and close.
Thanks, Gautam. Yeah. Thanks. So, I put the slide up, but before, this is where I started in the morning. Before I start that, I think we're missing at least 3 colleagues here who would have been to Urban Arc before, but who should have been on this panel and probably better than I am to bring this together. One is Michael Keith from Oxford, who is not only an anthropologist, but he's also a practicing politician. He was, he was one of the mayors of parts of London. The second, of course, is Karen Levy, who's been with us on this journey for many, many years from UCL in UK. And Edgar's just been mentioned now from the University of Cape Town. The reason I'm saying this is that, what we're sharing with you today is, it's not something that's only situated in this place and with this set of people who are in this room. This is a much wider range of discussions, and it's been a long journey in some ways. But I guess the question for us is what you've seen Sudeshna, Gautam, and Shriya sort of lay out is a set of, our take and our responses to the question of inequality and marginality. But the question, I guess, is why should a set of academics or practitioners be engaging in this question or these questions? Because by and large, what we know in practice is the margins only shift typically through the process of contest, of pushback, of struggle, and sometimes even more significant conflict. That's what the world talks about. If you pick up the newspapers every day, or if you watch YouTube and you see what's happening in Gaza, that's, in some senses what the lived reality is like. So I guess the question is, why should we be engaging with these questions in the first place? And I think the important thing in that is most of what we see today, the margins that are created in our minds. They're created in the ideas that sit behind these processes, which are produced and reproduced again and again and again. So whether you see Gaza today or Mariupol before that, and I'm taking examples from outside this space, or you go back to, apartheid practices in South Africa, or you go to the Black Lives Matter conflict in the United States that's been going on. Behind this sit very robust ideas, and those ideas haven't come from nowhere. They've, of course, come from social and political practices, but they've also come from people who thought about these things and have constructed them, and they've been reproduced in a whole range of institutions. So in a sense, what we're trying to interrogate here is it possible, and I think that's the provocation, is it possible for people who work in the area of knowledge creation to start undoing the way some of these ideas work in actual practice? And we have many examples of them. Gramsci has been talked about just now. But Ambedkar is, I think, one of the most remarkable examples in our own context in India, and that's what he did for his entire career. For those of you who don't necessarily come from India, he was a very important academic. He had 2 PhDs, one in economics and one in law. He was one of the key leaders of a whole range of people who are now in a slightly different place than when he started his struggles. And he also helped create India's constitution, which in some senses encapsulate a lot of these processes of trying to shift the margins. So I guess the larger question we're asking here is it possible for new configurations of movements of people, of institutions to start interrogating and acting on these questions and establishing a process by which processes can come back? I think, our colleagues from Cuba have lived through this for decades and at least 2 generations, and bring that back into knowledge creation. So I think that's the kind of, the abstract question that we're asking in some senses. And I would say the minimal elements in that is, of course, the ideas and how the epistemology is constructed and how the process works itself out, etc. The people who are very critical. And that's why academic and knowledge institutions in its wider sense, not only universities, but a whole range of other places. There are many forms of knowledges, and knowledge is created continuously in everyday life. So I'm talking about in the larger context. And finally, the institutions in which they're situated. They don't necessarily have to be formal institutions. All the responses that we're seeing, the most creative responses that we're seeing in the most vulnerable parts of the world, including in our cities, actually come from outside the so-called formal knowledge spaces. But the nature of knowledge spaces has shifted in India, at least for the last 75 years, because, when we started in the post-independence era, we had a very small proportion of people, of elites, who could actually go to higher education institutions. And now we're in the 20%, and at some point of time, we would go even further. So the nature of where knowledge is created and the access to that is, I think, as we sort of democratize who creates knowledge and how knowledge is created is quite important. So in some senses, what we've tried to do here, and the reason I mentioned colleagues from other parts of the world, is these attempts are not only happening here, and it's happening in other places, including in Latin America, where the struggle is very, very severe at the current point of time, can you create these configurations where these kind of questions are possible and can be dealt with? That's, I think, the larger question. And I think, to some extent, in a limited way, we've done that here. And we do this, it's kind of surprising, but this institution in the last 15 years, for better or for worse, in a concrete sense, touches the lives of 17 million people. So academic institutions are not meant to do that. But if we were not able to do that, we would not be able to talk with you. I talk to you with these experiences and the confidence to say, look, this can be done. 17 million is very small compared to the larger Indian population. It's bigger than many countries, bigger than many cities, fine. But in India's context, it's a small fraction. So for us, impact, both epistemically and otherwise, is to be able to engage at least with 5 or 10%, because the tipping points in systems start happening and acting in that space. The question for us, I guess, is, as we're looking to other partners and institutions in other parts of the world and in this country, is how can we build a solidarity, not only of action, of protest, of implementation, but also knowledge generation in ways that you can speak to those contexts that people are in. Because, this country is very large. We have 30-odd states and union territories. You need to have that institutional capacity to create locally relevant knowledges and processes and change knowledge institutions in that locality, in that language, in those multiple cultures at the same time. And in that sense, I would say that is the larger project that we're kind of involved in. The reason I put this up on the top is, this polycrisis is a huge challenge, but it's also a tremendous opportunity, because that gives you, the boundaries are shifting. And when the boundaries shift, then, if there are a whole range of new sets of processes and ideas inside, there are ways that they can slip in and actually sort of organize and change things. So this is a deep systemic crisis, and also simultaneously, as we see it, and we are horrified on television every day by all the kind of things that happen in this country and other parts of the world, there's also an opportunity of making these big shifts and changes. But the people and the institutions have to be ready to make that happen. And they have to have the strength of conviction, because we have to move, at least in our experience, move from our primary role, which has kind of evolved since the 19th century, at least of the university, of being able to critique and understand how things are working, to move to proposition. And the reason is very simple. Like I stated in the morning, much of the knowledges of the past are useful in the past, and we need to be grounded in them. And I'll show you what that means in 2 seconds. But we have to prepare for a world that's changing dramatically. So we have to be very flexible, very plastic, and create our epistemic frameworks, our processes, and our institutions to do that. So, for example, the way that IIHS is structured is rather different from most other universities. We do not have departments here. We have schools that are organized around questions and problems, fine? Which is, people get a little confused by that, saying, where are your departments? Where are your, where are your disciplines? Now, of course, most of our work is based on disciplinary work. It's based on knowledge structures. But in actual fact, if you want to respond to deeper questions of inequality, marginality, the organizing principles that sit behind the polycrisis, you need to reorganize the way that you do things. You have to reorganize your pedagogy, your practices, your curriculum, and the way that things work. And for better or for worse, we have our fellows in the room. This seems to work, and some of them go out and do good things. They get jobs, and they actually get employed. Some of them, do PhDs from interesting places and get are sort of employed in that. So this is, in some senses, So I'm just going to go through and give you a few data points on this. The question is, and this is a global crisis, fine? There was a systemic response to what happened in 2008 and what happened in let's say, in Northern Africa in 2011, and that was called the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'll just give you, I'm going to take you from the hyper-local to the global, fine? So this is an agenda. It was negotiated. Some of us were involved in that negotiation. In fact, Goal 11 there that you see was negotiated in this room. Yeah, the framework was built here. Many of our colleagues were part of the process. Some of them are smiling in the room. It was done here, fine? It was taken from here to the United Nations, etc., etc. In that are some fairly radical ideas, and the line at the bottom is the most important one. The idea that margins are recognized, and we need to look at universal responses to all of these questions, to people, to place, and to ecosystems, because without ecosystems, you can't have people or place in some senses. What's the status on this at the current point of time? This comes from some of the work. We were at the General Assembly earlier last year in September. The story is very bad. We set up these great goals, said we're going to get there by 2030, we're going to end poverty, deal with hunger and universal education and a whole range of other things. The most important ones and the most difficult ones were Goal 5, like I mentioned, on gender equality, and 10. This system, this negotiation almost failed. It took a day and a half longer than we expected in the General Assembly, specifically on the question of gender. And also, of course, on the question of inequality. The status as of last year, this is kind of the latest data that we have, is that 2/3 of these targets and these goals that we agreed to, the countries of the world agreed to this, fine, to this agenda, have had no progress. 15% are in reversal, and only about, less than 20% are on track. Fine? I'm just giving you, so this is the state of the world as we know it. And, the global economy is growing pretty well. It's growing quite quickly. And for those of you who would like to remember it, at the moment, at this current point of time, this year, the size of the global economy is about $100 trillion. So there's enough money in the world to deal with this kind of stuff, but it's not happening. And the reason that it's not happening, and I'll show you where we are in the world today, and this is an important sort of set of things. Same story there, and I'll take you through, we want to replicate knowledge, ideas, progress, the standard model of development, but the fact is, look at Germany. Germany is actually pretty good. I haven't shown you Finland, which is right on the top. So you look at the top there, the number at the top is a ranking in terms of how you're achieving these goals, fine? So that's Germany there. If you look at SDG 5, which is gender justice, Germany is doing much better than many other countries. If that blue line goes out to the end, you're at the goal. They're pretty good on 10 also, which is inequality. Look at the UK. UK is not good at all on number 10. UK is becoming much worse on number 5, especially after Brexit. Cool. So, there are deep challenges, and of course, on a whole range of environmental goals, they're not doing very well at all. So the only thing that UK seems to be doing well at the current point of time is on infrastructure. That's the United States. This is something that really surprises people at all. So the US is, and obviously, and this is a post-Trump, in the middle of Biden's story, as far as that's concerned, it's number 39 in the rankings. And why is that so? Environmental questions, of course, but it's because of 5 and 10. The deepening inequality, the crisis that you see, it's all over the place, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's Brazil. We know Brazil is one of the most unequal countries in the world. It became a lot better during the Lula years. It became much worse in the last few years, especially during COVID. And they're really struggling to come back here. Look at the reds on that process as far as that's concerned. So here, the margins are absolutely clear. That's China, which has actually done the most dramatic things in terms of living people out of poverty. If you look at, the reason that we're actually doing well in the globe is because China has done stuff on Goal 1 on no poverty, done remarkable work on education, on healthcare, etc. It has lots of other issues, fine, and it doesn't report on many things. But the reason the global system has actually moved upwards is because of China. That is South Africa, our compatriots in challenging the world in terms of inequality. In some senses, the number 110, but that's India down there. Fine. So if you see India, you understand what the core challenges we have and how critical they are. Fine. Now, the reason I've showed you this whole litany here is not because, I want to take this discussion, which is very grounded, into the global sphere. It is an epistemic idea. And, sometimes people get very angry when I say this, and sometimes when I did this in Kigali a few, months ago, there was a sort of, there was an ovation in some senses. The idea is very simple. The idea is that every country is a developing country. And I just put the Kigali side up because we were talking about climate and diversity at that point in time. It's a very simple idea. And you can take that down to the state level, you can take that down to the city level. It doesn't matter where you are. Fine? Okay? On some dimension or the other of a globally agreed compact, every country is a developing country. So the question of one being ahead, the standard model working, or X and Y and Z, is actually with the objective facts that you can see here. This is the latest data that's currently available across the world. Right? That's an important way of trying to look at the world. So if every country is a developing country, then we've all got to make collective progress. Plus, we have to address the most systemic questions that we have, of which poverty, inequality, marginality are absolutely central. If you can't do that, you can't do pretty much everything else as far as that's concerned. Right? And we're doing that in a world in which this risk of conflict, of collapse that we're seeing pretty much every day in social media, television, is growing exponentially. And it's going to become worse. We know that. The physics is telling us on the climate side and the biodiversity side, it's going to become worse. Right? So the question then is, what forms of knowledges, what forms of practices, what forms of institutions are fit to enable us to address these questions that we know are here and are going to become worse? So this is a point of disjunct. So can we use that point of disjunct to do some things differently? That's, I guess, what we were trying to, and very concretely. This is a very abstract story, but the fact is that the ideas that we have don't necessarily correspond to the reality. And the discourse that we draw upon, that's why I intervened in the morning, very often corresponds to a different age and time and not to where we are today. And that's the reason why people across all of our cities in the global north or south are building their own stuff, because if you have to survive and you're vulnerable and you're marginal, then, you don't care about the theory and who said X and Y and Z about this movement or that. It doesn't make a difference in some senses. So you're building theory and practice as you go. Fine? So I'm going to put forward, and anybody from Oxford in the room? Okay, anyway. So, this is photographs that I took, so they're not very nice. And Michael is not here, so otherwise we would have had a good conversation, because this is an old conversation that we had. So I'm going to give you a set of images which speak to maybe why. It's both an opportunity and a challenge. So in a sense, these disjuncts in history and otherwise do enable both knowledge systems and societies and cultures to respond and do that structurally. I'm going to give you one example. It's a very provocative example, but I'm going to show it to you in any case. Okay. So these are photographs. I was at Oxford for about 10 days in September, and these are photographs that I took, so they're not very good. Fine. There's a library here. Fine. It's probably the most important library in the English-speaking world. It has the largest collection of books, mainly because at a certain point of time, the government of that point of time, the monarchy of the time, said everything that's ever published will go into this library. So there are 13 million books. You can't see them there. They're below this library. Fine. It's a very important library. And essentially, as we know, universities are situated around this. Scholarship has grown from this. Fine. And those of you, if you step out of that corner there, much of this was in Harry Potter. So, you might recognize it, because it was a lot of the Harry Potter things were shot in the Divinity School and part of that in the library. So that's the interesting part of that thing. So this is the official sort of framework of the Bodleian. Okay? This is what they say. It's one of the world's oldest and more renowned libraries, so you find the same things at Harvard and other places. So the reason I'm showing you this is that in September 2023, the framework of how you construct and reproduce knowledge and you make your claims in terms of where you are and what it is. And Oxford is a remarkable institution. It's great. It does, it's been very, very important, including in the creation of Brexit, because they created the PPE, which then strengthened some people who had interesting politics to do whatever it is. So the library is the center of this game, fine? So how is a library organized is quite interesting. So that's the shot there. This is what the entry into it. Of course, Everything's in Latin because it's important for us to be able to maintain Latin because Latin is classical and that's how knowledge is created. Fine. So we've done a minor sort of, representation or translation from the Latin. That's the entry into the portal of the thing. But the more interesting thing is how the library is organized. And how the library is organized and how we want to represent itself is, at least my hypothesis, part of the challenge that we have today. So if you go to the doors into the library, fine, these are the classic frameworks of organization which were in place in 1602. Fine. Oxford, like Harvard and many other institutions, what Edgar and we talk about as, leading Baroque institutions in some senses, their framework for knowledge creation, their framework for organization of epistemology, their framework for knowledge reproduction is classical and important, but it may not be fit for purpose for the world that we live in, and certainly not for the world that is coming. That's what the question of, the future city is. So that's the second door there, okay? The School of Jurisprudence. The third door there, the School of Ancient Medicine. The fourth door there, the School of the really important languages, Hebrew and Greek, and of course, geometry and arithmetic that sort of define the development of the sciences in some sense, the School of Logic. This is, again, recreation from, you go back to Aristotle, Plato, the Academy, etc., as far as that's concerned, the School of Moral Philosophy, and finally, the School of Grammar and History, and the School of Natural Philosophy. So it's not a critique of Oxford. Oxford has managed to maintain this thing. It's remarkable. I mean, we had universities in this country well before Oxford was created. They were around for 1,000 years and they're no longer here. And that may be part of the challenges that we have. But what I'm suggesting is the epistemic frames that we work to, the kind of ideas that we hold to, the kind of structures that we build on, fine, are very critical. And marginality may well be created in the world that we're talking about by this framework that we're using here. And that's not a critique of the Oxford framework in some senses. But it may not be workable for a world with 8 billion people, which is highly unequal, fine? And has, because India holds it, the largest population of poor people that ever lived. So, if these things are important to us and they're values that countries have signed off on, prime ministers stand up and talk about them, or presidents do that, our knowledge structures have to change. Our ways that we organize knowledge institutions have to change. And the way that we privilege some things above other things have to change, right? So, if you don't shift this, and, I can give you, some sense of context and sense. So this library was established in 1602. Fine. What was the disjunct that was happening at the point of time that this library was created? If you go back maybe 100, 150 years before that, I mean, those of you who are historians obviously know the number, knows the dates. What happened in 1453 that changed the world? And they've all got to do with cities, fine? Yeah, I can hear that. Louder, guys. Mehmed II took over Constantinople, fine? He didn't destroy the city. He didn't do a Gaza on it. And that's why we have Istanbul at the current point of time, fine? And then what happened? Columbus went somewhere looking for the village my grandparents came from, because they produce the best pepper in the world there still, fine? And he landed up in an interesting place, which is the next sort of... A few years later, 1492, da Gama actually arrived in the village which my grandparents grew up in, which produces the best pepper in the world. Fine. And then they created Old Goa, another city as far as that's concerned. Then a few years later, to try and make sure all of this actually makes sense, there was a famous, Latin Americans know this quite well, the Treaty of Tordesillas, which basically divided the world between Spain and Portugal. Very interesting idea, but a very deep idea. The history of colonization of pretty much all the world was decided around that. It was an idea. The idea that you can, these were marginal powers, fine? Figuring out what was happening. India and China at that point of time, 55% of global output. They didn't care about what the hell was happening in the other parts of the world, fine? Remember, at this point of time, 1526, first Battle of Panipat, Akbar was born in 1555. These were places out there somewhere else. Nobody had any interest in them in some senses. But they still had the idea that they could take the world and divide it and then decide how they were able to control and conquer this process, fine. So this was produced out of the great conflict that took place between Spain and England at that point of time. Just 100 meters from this particular door that's there, the Archbishop of Canterbury was burnt at the stake in 1555. Pretty much the same time that Akbar was taking over here. Okay, he was burnt at the stake for what? For ideas. It was a battle between Catholicism and what Henry VIII had left at that point of time. This library was created a year before Elizabeth I, not the second, died, because she knew how important it was to be able to bring the canon together, because they had to create a new relationship between state and church. So there's a very practical reality that connects these processes up along with the kind of stuff that we see. So, these histories are not sort of abstract and irrelevant. So the East India Company was created not very far from here at the same time that this library was created in 1600. So the confluence of these processes are not accidental. And we need to see our own location and process, our own, So Thomas Rowe came to Surat and came to Agra to meet with Jahangir 30 years after this. And Galileo was tried 50 years after this in Rome. So what I'm saying is, we are all embedded in history and process. We need to be able to connect what we're doing with what's happening. And the ideas that we work with and the ideas that we work to do and undo will actually change the world, hopefully after us, but potentially in our time, thankfully, because of internet, social media, and all the other wonderful things that we have. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Aram. So folks, we have a little bit of time left. We have unintentionally given you a glimpse at what faculty meetings at IIHS look like, and why we can never finish on time. So very quickly, normally we always have that dreaded person who gets up and says, this is more a comment than a question in academic conferences. That person is very welcome in this session. Please feel free to comment and speak and ask. Feel free to, we'll open up the floor, but it actually would be very nice, just also if anyone feels like sharing just reflections to those same questions, thinking about frames around questions of marginality and inequality, thinking of your practices, thinking of your own work. Please feel free to share them, think out loud with us. We have only our questions to offer. And we're also happy to take a few questions directly if there are to any of us. So we'll start from there.
So what I would like to ask is, what if the groups which we situate or study at the margins do not conceive themselves as marginalized? Suppose, how do we as academicians and researchers problematize their situation? So even if we are studying a field, doing a study in a field, and there are maybe 2 or 3 responses who say that in the field which we are studying as a marginalized space, if the respondents from there come up and say that no, we are better than before, and we don't feel that we are at any disadvantage position, because whatever our condition was before, now we have better conditions. Sure. And as Bhan sir said that it's always relational. So then how, as an academician or a researcher, do we see such responses as outliers, or we need to engage with such responses too?
Sure. Thank you. Flo.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was brilliant, and there are so many takeaways. This is an interesting thing of institutionalizing informality and how you are thinking about marginality. I want to spend a little more time thinking about what we have is enough, as against this attitude of yet to come. And I find if we spend little time on this particular sensibility, which I find it's largely lacking of what we have is enough at two levels, at the level of a very individual, at the level of the psyches in which we operate as humans, and also at the level of the state. Because if we look at today's state, it works on fear and insecurity. And really, if margins become enough the way they are, it challenges the modern statecraft, which has to be incomplete. Modern statecraft has to have these spaces, has to give this imagination of yet to come. So how does really state understands this language? Because I think that present state cannot even understand this grammar that we are trying to talk about over here, and which makes it important as well. And somewhere what Gautam was saying by the end, I find little answer, but I want to think with all of you when it comes to vulnerability. Because maybe somewhere the answer lies in vulnerability, and the relation of margin and state is such that as we reimagine the margins, it also pushes a certain idea of state, which will be a vulnerable state and not really a weak state, which we need today. At the level of individual, I'm not sure, but I'm just thinking, what does it mean to inhabit a sensibility like this? And maybe somewhere the root is a vulnerable ontological self which is required. And I go back to what Gautam was saying, what do we need to know what is happening? And somewhere it is very much connected with this idea of how do we inhabit an idea, and maybe before that, how do we inhabit a sensibility? And maybe both of them go hand in hand. Yeah.
Sorry, can I go back to anyone? Yeah. Both of you, just one after the other.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for this incredible multi-scalar panel. So yeah, I think like my question is something around these spaces of knowledge production and the access or the power structures which exist, right? Because so there is this whole concept of, there's this interesting book which is written, The Colonial Constitution. And the whole emphasis is that the state is always towering the people, right? I mean, and so I work in the urban governance space, and one of the most sort of a basic question which comes to my mind always when I interact with the senior IS officer with whom I'm working back with is that how do I unpack this knowledge which we are discussing here, sometimes in that 2 minutes which I have one-on-one, face-to-face with him? Because what we talk about it over a period of years and decades and PhDs and research papers, he has the power to do it at a stroke of a pen, right? But then often there is that inaccessibility in terms of the language which we speak here versus what is to be spoken there, right? So my question is in a way more like a sort of I need some sort of a framework as to how does one think of finding this space of engagement in a way that it really translates into some form of an impact, however one wants to define impact. Sure. So yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you for this excellent panel discussion. What I have is not exactly a question, but it's neither a comment. So somewhere in between.
As my students often say to me these days, you do you.
I was just thinking about the floods which happened in Bangalore last year following the rains. There was a lot of talk at that point about how the infrastructure system of Bangalore had failed its people and how institutional apathy had caused the floods one way or the other. But the fact is that, and there's research also supporting this, that the flooding of Bangalore belongs to a design philosophy which the city of Bangalore does not exist in. It belongs to a world which the city of Bangalore doesn't exist in, and it was never designed for that world. And a lot of these dichotomies that we were talking about through this session and through the whole of today, distinctions like informal, formal, urban, rural, developing and developed, or for that matter, even something which has come under attack in the West recently, nature and culture, or nature and society, and things like that. They belong to worlds which are not set up which were never designed for and which are not appropriate for the Indian or the landscape across most of the global south. And it's also not the landscape which most of the people in the global south live in, through their cultures or whatever you want to call it. So when we're talking about these sort of distinctions, when we're talking about making the margins the center, or when we're talking about taking practices of informality and understanding how we can privilege them to a position where they're considered legitimate practices, are we not still falling under that distinction ourselves, and in that sense, not part of the world that we need to be living in and we need to be moving towards? And how do we make that transition?
Sure. Yes, can you hold on to this? Should we take a couple more? Bhan? We can do a couple? Okay, we'll take, how will we do this? We'll take one more, do a quick round of response, otherwise we will forget, and then we'll do a second round with folks. Yeah? Okay.
Am I audible? So it's a very simple question which actually came to my mind when I was listening to Gautam and Shriya. And, first of all, your responses, the practices you were talking about, it's promising and it gives a hope. But I was just wondering that, if when we see urban poor, when we understand the urban poor, most of them are migrants from different parts of the country, and they are not homogeneous groups. They have different context, different milieux, different lived realities. And when there is a shift, when they move to the cities, they carry their native rural baggage with them. And there is a constant anxiety. They go through constant dilemmas, grappling with this identity, dual identity of whether they are rural or urban. So in this complexity, in that light, how do you see, how do you understand these, your responses to social protection and urban transitions? Thank you.
Okay, let's we do a quick round and be brief. Okay, so we'll just go through. We're not going to respond to all of. We'll just give a couple of comments as much as we can, because I think what's useful is to just leave the questions amongst us all for discussion on the floor. And I'm also very cognizant of time. So I'll say two things very quickly. Aditi, to your question, I don't think any of us would call a space marginalized. That would be an act of a sort of categorical imposition that I would hope any of our training would not allow us to do. You go to a space as a space. You will see margins and centers, powers and vulnerabilities. And as far as I know, most human beings will always never, because in our conversations with people or in any place, if you asked me, are you marginalized? There is no answer to that question that fits binaries, right? So I think that the way to think about those questions is we will always be in sites where the nature of vulnerabilities are shifting and dynamic, right? And those vulnerabilities don't exhaust agency, but agency alone does not hide vulnerability. And I think that many vulnerabilities are present. They're articulated, they shift, they don't have to be agreed upon unanimously. And you don't need a survey to say 87% of people felt vulnerable, therefore vulnerability. So I think that we work with the way sometimes to think about is, and it's, I think, very close to this idea of what we have is enough. It's not quite that, actually, Jyoti. It's what we have could be enough. To be open to the possibility that it already could be enough. That doesn't mean we don't want more. That doesn't mean that it becomes our ceiling. But it refuses an initial understanding of inadequacy, an automatic understanding of inadequacy. And that, I think, is a slightly different place. Because remember, our own imaginations are shaped by what we believe is possible. Right? When we see more things, our imagination grows. When we think something is possible, so even the person who says, I have enough, may not say it the next minute when a thought occurs to them. I would say our job is to maximize the kinds of choices people have and not presume what those right choices are. And I think if we think about those maximized choices, take the question of migration. I honestly think it's a word we should retire. Because to me, the one thing we know about an urbanizing world is that we should take mobility as a foundational given. People will move, people will always move. And I think the word migrant, like the word informal, has begun to do us a disservice because no one ever stops being a migrant. You live in a city for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. When does migrant become resident? Right? So to me, the question is, if you believe that mobility is a fundamental part of urbanization, all our social protection should be designed assuming people move, and people will always move. And they will not move in single directions from rural to urban or urban to urban. But I think that it links to my response to your questions. Categories will always fail you just as they save you. That is the work of categories. Language is always insufficient, and it's the only thing we have. So the job of our words is to keep using them to open up new meaning and let them go when they stop opening up that meaning. Informal was a critical word for us in the 80s. We stopped using it in 2000s, and now when we teach, you ask our students, we say, don't use this word. Use anything else other than this. You know, I grew up as a gay man in India in the 90s. If I didn't have that English word gay that had no roots, I would not have survived. That doesn't mean the word is not inadequate. It doesn't mean that I didn't let it go to find other words that fit me better. I think that our relationship with categories can be a little gentler and lighter. I think sometimes we want them to do too much for us, to explain everything, to be neat, to hold. That's not their job. They should work for us in the moment we use them. And then they should run out of steam because the world changes and we should be able to grow to new categories. So, you know, it's the same thing with binaries. Binaries are useful sometimes. Language is useful sometimes. So I think as long as we can be light in our use of categories, the only thing I would say is not, is this the right word for this? Is to say, when I use this word, does something make sense to me in what I'm seeing? Does the word help you make sense of the world? If it does, it's not a wrong word. It's a word that for you is productive. And I think that's the search for knowledge. Let's find those other kinds of words. And I think the last thing I'll say about Rohit, your point on translation, is really a point on, I think that's precisely that challenge. But if you begin again by assuming that that IAS officer is capable of understanding ontology as much as operations, and do him that assumptional favor as well, then I think the trick only will also to be that our ability to translate across multiple registers has to be part of our work as scholars. And what that translation looks like, when we do it, I don't know which translation will work for which place. But think of yourself as a teacher. When we teach, each of our students listens differently. And we're constantly trying to translate for each one of them into a metaphor, or an example, or a language they will understand. And we are constantly failing. But over time, they learn to understand what we mean when we say things. And we learn to understand what they hear when we say things. It's the only way that language can grow. So that's the push. Yeah.
Just one quick thing, because I think Gautam has mostly covered everything. I just wanted to add one more thing. I think across all of the projects that we are talking about, I think one of the things that we are pushing for a lot is that there is a hat that we are wearing as a researcher. There's also a hat that we are wearing as a practitioner. And those two worlds are not necessarily sitting in the happiest confluence with each other. And so on one hand, it is possible to radically diagnose fundamentally what needs to shift, and yet wake up the next morning and say, what is it that can be done today? What are the people that I can speak to today, and how to move forward from knowing all of the things, but at the same time, that knowing can also be complete paralysis. And so I think in some ways, that language about, sort of instituting the margins into the systems, thinking about it as normal, or having the normal sort of have a much wider spectrum, is not so much about saying that it is enough, but it is also two ways of a political project to say it is a harm reduction. It's not sort of a roll back into a situation which can be worse. It's institutionalizing it so that the status quo can also remain. And then also thinking of a benefit maximization. But this is a constant everyday politics. And so thinking about not so much of saying that it is enough from a space of comfort. But it is enough also as a political moment to say, not in this direction, but in this direction. And how? What is the propositive, what is the systemic ways of sort of, kind of speaking to that kind of a project? So, I mean, I think that speaks to across a lot of things, but I'll stop there.
I'll also do very brief because a lot of it has already come up, but I just wanted to add one layer of reflection onto what Sudeshna just said, which is also our roles in knowledge institutions as pedagogues, right? And also on, I mean, the point about, knowledge production spaces and access came up. And I think it's also bringing some of these larger ideas that we spoke about in our world of practice into a conversation that is bringing multiple forms of knowledges together, right? In a knowledge institution, a point that Aro was also making, but also respecting the multiplicity and diversity of sources of knowledge and basically being able to build this new language together, right? Like the idea of categories, the use of the word marginalization, of course, those are not adequate. But how do we move towards a new language, and how do we do that together in the space of a knowledge institution, layering all of those different identities and hats that we constantly wear? Just wanted to add that.
Hi, let me go to Flo. So I know Barbara had a hand up, Sunny had his hand up. I'll come back to you. So Barbara, you had your hand up? Yeah? Then Sunny, and then I saw Ranjani's hand up early, and then I'll go one here and one back. Yeah, and then Chetan, and then we have to stop.
I'll be super brief because I think actually it was just bouncing off a question at the back, and I think it's a little bit questioning that good enough. No, it's not good enough. It is enough framing that you have, and I think the question of how does one integrate that notion of it is enough with at the same time the notion that things need to change, and need to change in addressing the polycrisis that we're talking about. So the questions of material inequalities, marginalities, but also this big climate crisis that's looming on all of us. And I think trying to think about what are the processes that enable building that interconnection between appreciating it is enough already, but we all collectively need to change. And I think that's a really difficult kernel for us to crack. And there are some really interesting experimentations around that, but I think they tend to be experimentation, and planning generally doesn't know how to deal with it.
Sure. Thanks. Sunny?
As Aro was going about these things, there was a time when people were they were fighting and they were there were enough resources and people were trying, we can achieve. And we had this discussion, but that time also I was confused about it, that we can achieve anything, we'll build more and then you're saying we had enough. So I'm an architect, I also thought I had enough of building, and then I came here, because that seriously is I had enough of building and I came here, and then there was this thing that at one spectrum, people saying that we need to degrowth, that they were discussing, and we are sitting here, we need to say that inequalities are there. We need to grow here, but we need not to grow here. So that definitions are not that the growth or degrowth had that definition of things, but there where we are saying that we had enough of things, and still when we go in the field and see that they're asking something more, they're asking very similar things of that growth, which we are trying to deny at certain point of time and saying that they should not have. So those, even me shifting my, this thing from architecture to coming here, it is I said that enough not building, but what more?
That's right.
If we go there, I see the people's building and they're saying that, but we want the building, but in what sense they want the building? I'm still very confused at what they want or what they want. They are pretty much clear what they want, but me being there, how will I treat it? How will I give any solution at that part? So
that's a very good question. Ranjani.
Yeah, this is not a fully formed comment, but I just wanted to respond to the mention of Oxford and Harvard. I think, as academicians or people who are sort of engaging in academe, it's kind of important to know what the role of these certain institutions are, which, there is a reason why, Oxford was started at that point and then the East India Company, and why, members of parliament who were produced by Oxford were also shareholders in the East India Company. So the role of these institutions is to kind of reproduce the ruling class and, are often like the centers of racial capitalism and, probably all the things that sort of produce marginality. And I think we can see that kind of reflected today in the kind of battles over institutions right now in the US. I mean, you mentioned Gaza. It's because the margins through DEI, which is what is being contested, are sort of, entering academia and kind of challenging this ivory tower. And so the ruling class is not being socially reproduced in the way that they wanted, right? And you kind of see the similar kind of battle here with reservations. So I don't know. I think that, as academicians, we should also maybe loosely hold on to institutions altogether because, they have a certain function, but that might not align with, what we actually want to do if we, want emancipation.
Just behind you. Tracy, I'll come to you.
Hi, thank you so much for such an interesting panel and all the questions. I have a very short comment, observation. I don't know how this will go, but I was thinking about even as a practitioner and now as a researcher, this idea when you're working with quote unquote urban poor or in informal settlements, they're kind of looked at as if they are spatially bounded. And they don't exist outside of these spaces, and how we see them is also very limited to their survival needs. How we study these spaces, how we study these aspirations are very limited to these means of survival. And that is not to say that that's not important, but the another aspect of it that I have, in my experience, come to sense a lot is this idea of aspirations, this idea of short-lived possessions, refrigerators, TVs, ACs. These things become important in the way people assert their identity, their location in these spaces. And also this idea, for example, of housing. So like you mentioned about when does one stop being a migrant and becomes a resident. So in Delhi, you have these informal settlements that are mostly that came up in 70s. So there are people living here for more than 50 years, but are still referred to as migrants. So their housing becomes important. Is it tiled in that informal settlement? If one housing is tiled, it becomes an idea of how long they have been there because it's a stake in that land. Mm-hmm. So I think a very important part of this knowledge production around informality of these areas is this idea of moving beyond just the survival needs and to look at also in the sense of moving out and inside of these spaces, and also this idea of everyday intricacies. And obviously, as we said, these are not very homogeneous spaces. Sure. So there is a lot of diversity in also how culture plays a role in how people aspire for their future sure. or aspire for how they want to live in these spaces. So yeah, thank you.
Chetan, Joyce, and then quick close. Yes.
Yeah. Hi, I'm just trying to sort of think alongside what has happened, and I work very far away from these discussions, to be honest. But as I think about it, I think your emphasis upon what we have is a very interesting one. As I understand, practice always sort of struggles with finding local linkages with knowledge. In that sense, global linkages with knowledge do not help practice in many ways. And one of the things that sort of I struggle with myself around this question of practice and this local linkages is a question of what you call pseudo action. It's a problem of repetition as it comes along, in that sense that at what point our urge for newness only repeats what exists before, in that sense. And the challenge that emerges is that newness doesn't come from our urge for newness. Actually, newness comes from radical newness comes from radical repetition. In some senses, as you see, it's exactly what you're saying, in that sense that it's only when we affirm what is happening on the ground, right. It's only from there something new can emerge. So radical newness always precedes.
That is my answer to all the questions. That's exactly what I mean by enough, which he has said much better than I just did. Yeah.
The only thing that I would sort of add to that is the same sort of logic and conceptual basis applies to knowledges also.
Yes,
that even with knowledges, that rigor of what we have and working with what we have can only create something more from from there. I think our urge for having some new knowledge out there without, in some senses, looking at and affirming what we have and what we are working with at this. What are the forming the local linkages? What are the words that are actually working on the ground? As I think Gautam said, would be something we need to, I think, collectively think about.
And come sit here. Yeah. Just. It'll just come because people are online. That's it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, and thank you everybody, and thank you for this amazing panel, for this amazing discussion and this open-minded discussion. I think it's necessary to continue. And I want to arise an experience we had just 2 years ago in a neighborhood, in an informal neighborhood. We are going to talking about it a little bit tomorrow, but not exactly about this experience. And this has to do with the first question and the last comments. And is the thing that there is a difference, a bit difference between the objectives, the objective facts, and the psychological position of the people. This social approach of marginalities, and then how you can feel yourself about what to do and what to have in the future. And was an experience in a neighborhood where the community organized themselves and called the university just for do some architecture and urban projects. And we say, yes, of course, we do that, you know. And then we engage in everything, in the discussions, in the social approach of other parts of the university. And then we bring our students and discuss with them, we play with them in different play role. I don't know exactly how to say in English, but this a community place or to see what they need and what they want, and at the end they see the other people, the other students, and they say, "Oh, I can go to the university. I can be a post-grade student." Yeah. Yes, why not? We don't feel like that. We don't feel like we can reach that level because we live in these conditions. Then living condition, housing, urban environment, and economic position can diminish yourself. And we as academics, as universities, we can unpack in this marginalities that you are feeling is not what the government give in our case. I know in other cases it's different. I'm from Cuban, sorry, I didn't say, but Cuban is really different in this way, and we have open up opportunities for the universities. Actually, they are completely public, completely free, but the people don't feel they are in a way they can afford the university, not from the money, from the economic side, but from the place where they live, the people which they are exchange every day. Then I think we have a lot to do in this sense, and we can unpackage these other marginalities we cannot see. They are not real objectives, maybe. They are subjectives, but they are reality as well. Thank you so much.
All right. Quick round of responses from this way. Yeah.
So I have a question.
Okay.
The panel is very interesting. My question is, when we speak about addressing marginalities, inequalities, global polycrisis, why the accumulation of wealth or distribution of it and resulting social impacts or social unrest is not talked about as an issue? Is it an out of syllabus question?
Sure. Thank you. Arun.
Quick response to that, at least, that's very much centrally involved. I mean, I talked about this in the morning. wealth and the creation of different forms of capital is central to the question of inequality and reproduction of that. So, I mean, it's not only it's not a question of out of syllabus. This is one of the core questions that have to be dealt with. And the system is reproducing this even during COVID. That's what happened in COVID. All economic indicators went downhill, but wealth inequality grew dramatically at that point of time because of the system that's creating it. So in that sense, it's a central question. You can't address this without others. But just a quick response. I think just as a provocation, imagination is quite important in this process. And very often, global imaginations, it depends on, whichever age you want to look at it. Take a concrete thing. Chinese porcelain in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. It was an imagination. And you see, how across Europe, people tried really, really hard to be able to create that because that was an imagination of what, a particular culture could do. It was very difficult to achieve in many ways. And then eventually the British only managed to do that in the mid-19th century. So imagination is something that travels across various places. That and myth-making in some senses are very important. And universities are institutionalized places in which both these things are constructed and they're conflated. To respond to the other question that said the reason why we are speaking in the language that we speak is partially because of Oxford, or in the case of Spanish, Salamanca. So there's an importance of these institutions, but what they create and reproduce may not be appropriate for the context that you're living in. And the question then is, how do you change them? Especially if maintaining the system and structure as it is part of your vision and your mission. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
I think very brief. I know there was a lot, but I'll just take on the question of the university as a form. And I think that's something which is very close to all of our hearts. I think what we have here, and like a sliver of it which we talked about through the panel, is a little bit of an institutional experiment as a knowledge institution. And it isn't without its failings, but it is a little bit of an experiment. And, going back to what Aro is also referring to in his provocations, which was really on how do you move away from that classical framing and move to a more open-ended framing of a knowledge institution, and what are those that we can build collaboratively through collectives and mindful and respectful of each other's knowledges. So I'll just leave it there.
Two things from me. One is I wanted to actually respond to the question of the weak state, and is a state that takes vulnerable, doesn't make the state vulnerable. I think the one thing we should take from a lot of our feminist thinking about the state is to actually be appreciative of the weakness of a state, because every way we've thought about a strong state has been in very deeply masculinist patriarchal terms. And our notions of strength come from authority, right? But weakness or vulnerability are sources of strength. That is exactly what feminist questions of power asked us. So actually, I think our states could do with a lot more vulnerability and a lot more weakness. I think it would behoove us in many ways. A weak state is not one that doesn't deliver. It may seek to have a very different relationship with authority and representation. And I think there's a lot to learn about that as a possibility. So thanks for that provocation. And I think just to say what Chetan said, I think, just to take this as a co-production of that argument. So let's reframe it a little bit so we can be specific. If one begins with the idea that what exists must be affirmed, right? That it is not to be begun as thought as a problem to be solved, then all imaginations are possible. It doesn't make it the ceiling of what we want, but it means we begin from a ground under our feet, which is not a lack. Because I think that's a really, when I think about a question, so, the idea that when we look at the study that we did along with the slum map was a study of people's houses, how they built it over 15 years, the tiling, the work. It is evidence that what it is enough. Because it's evidence that what people are building in their own communities is not survival. It's aesthetics and joy and home and comfort, right? So that it is the evidence of that kind of affirmation. And Barbara, to your point, I think the point we're trying to make is if you begin with affirmation, only then we have the possibility to get to the next order of complexity. Because the thing, Sunny, is that the question you're asking is the question we are all asking. Because it is the question of this historical conjuncture. We had about 100 years. I can't historicize like Aro, so I'll do mini. Right? We had about 100 years in my head where human beings had two North Stars: modernization, globalization, industrialization. Right? We sort of knew what a good life meant. It was an imposed vision. It was an authoritarian vision, but it was a vision. Right? Even that authoritarian global vision no longer holds. And the thing is, what replaces the end of modernity as our goal, we don't know. What futures look like in the Anthropocene, we don't know. What aspiration looks like if it is not growth, we don't know. And that is exactly the question of the present. We are without language. But we are without language, in my head, civilizationally. That's why in the earlier panel, I was seeing this psychotic state. I was having far too much affinity with this psychotic state. There's a sense in which you're not quite sure what to fight. And I think when you look at the world around us right now, every response seems rational. Working class white voters who vote for Trump, who is destroying their jobs, but makes them feel empowered. Borders that are shutting, authoritarianism, but also radical solidarity. Every response feels logical because no magnet is pulling you towards North or South Pole. The magnets are not working. So I actually think that whether you guys like it or not, you all are the generation that will have to create a new imagination, to redefine enough, to redefine. And I think that the work then we do in that place with the communities is to collectively say, can we really start by figuring out what is it that we want? And maybe it's not the old things we thought we wanted. And it won't happen quickly and it won't happen easily. And we will keep building buildings for a while because we can't just stop. But maybe slowly we will stop building buildings the same way. Because at least we'll be looking to say, while I'm building a building today, I don't want to be building the same building tomorrow. And maybe that's what brought you here, when you said, at least I know this is not enough. What is, I don't know. But I think the proposition is to at least, like Ranjani was saying, at least shed off some of the ways that we have already been told that we are not enough. So at least let that go. Now, what happens when you let that go, nobody knows. So there is a set of people, okay, I was going to kill me for this. There is a set of people who keep saying, if not the current regime, then what? I'm like, let's find out. That's all I'm saying.
Actually, that's a really good note to end on. I just say one thing. I think all of your comments and questions have been so great as well, because I think we're all sort of struggling and trying to put words to the same things, right? I don't think that there's really a disjuncture of people coming from different places. I do see this thing. So I think I'm going to end on a really personal note, in the sense that I was trained as a planner, and it didn't sit well with me. And it didn't allow me to think about myself as a practitioner. And the practice that I did was fraught and psychotic and, problematic in so many ways. So I think doing research from place, holding the acknowledgement of saying that, that there is a disjuncture, there is a non-linearity to the way the world is functioning, I think has allowed me to also move non-linearly as a practitioner. And towards, much further along in my career, I find myself in practice spaces where I'm able to move, not necessarily towards any particular one goal, but it's a movement. And so I would say that the positionality that we're putting out in the world out there by using these terminologies also sort of reflects back in the positionality that we are holding as researchers and practitioners. And in that dialogue, I think, we move as well. So I'll just close with that. Thank you.
I thank you all very much for staying. Sorry for going over. And we will see you tomorrow. We'll see you tomorrow morning at 9:30. Please enjoy the rest of your evening in Bangalore. And